Awesome. Well, we are glad to be together again. I hope you had a great Easter weekend. I took most of Monday off because I was exhausted, but that's normal for Easter as a pastor. But it was great. Loved getting to celebrate Easter weekend with you. We got to talk through, for the past couple weeks, we talked about the promise of who Jesus was and then the purpose of why Jesus came. And I love getting to kind of work through that over the Easter season. But in doing so, we kind of took a break from what we've been going through, and that is the Sermon on the Mount. And the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus' kind of most famous kind of teaching, right? So it is a little bit weird to think about preaching on Jesus' sermon, right? Like I'm like doubling up on what he's saying, and that's not really the point. But what we understand about what Jesus did was that when Jesus preached about things, he also lived that way. Like he wasn't up there just saying, all right, don't be angry, and then he turns around and gets angry. He's not up there saying, you need to be peaceful, and then he goes and like starts a conflict. Like he lived with this consistency that you and I kind of struggle with sometimes, which is why the Sermon on the Mount is pretty important for us. You know, after I started thinking about this again, like I started kind of getting it back into my mind about Sermon on the Mount after taking a couple weeks off, and I started asking myself this question. Maybe you've asked this question. Maybe you showed up this morning and you said, why? Why are we continuing to go through the Sermon on the Mount? Like literally, we could have read it a couple times and moved on to something more fun, like finances or marriage. Politics? No, we'll stay with the Sermon on the Mount for now. All right, but we understand that the Sermon on the Mount is this beautiful picture of what God wants us to live by. That we have this kingdom on earth, right? That we don't have to wait until heaven to start living out the desires of God in our lives now. And so when he tells us how to live, Jesus remarkably lives among these same ways, right? Like when he tells us that blessed or like the good life are for the people who are meek, right? He goes to a cross quietly. Right? When he says, blessed are the peacemakers, right? He puts the ear back on the guy who Peter cut off because he didn't want to start a war. You see, he lived with this consistency that's difficult. And Jesus calls his disciples to live with that same consistency. That if we read the words of the Sermon on the Mount and we're called to what God has called us to live by, and yet we do something different, right? The Sermon on the Mount calls us this fun word that I would hate to be ever called. We'll probably have, right, a hypocrite. Someone who's acting. Someone who's pretending. You see, and the reason why we have to spend time talking about this is because we believe that the gospel and the good news and the mission of Jesus is vital to how we function as a church body. We believe that healthy disciples who live out the Sermon on the Mount, they cultivate a healthy church. Right? People who are like, nah, I'm good the way I am. I'm good with living however I want to. They don't make a church healthy, right? You have healthy disciples, they help cultivate a healthy church. And when a healthy church is filled with disciples who are going after Jesus, they engage in the mission of God. A healthy church does that. And the mission of God is essentially what Jesus is telling us to do, and that is to bring the kingdom of God here. You see, we live under this assumption that Jesus came so we don't go to hell. Or Jesus came so we can go to heaven. But in fact, Jesus came so that we can have this good, blessed, like flourishing life today. And while we're in the midst of all the brokenness of this world, this good life is available to us because Jesus is available to us. And the closer we get to following the rules and the laws and the things in the Sermon on the Mount, the more not Christ-like we become, which that happens, but the closer we actually get to Jesus himself. See, a healthy church looks for life transformation to be taking place in the life of the church members, of the people who are connected to the church in any way whatsoever. The transformation is taking place. And that's why we don't measure success by the size of our budget or the amount of people who are sitting here on a Sunday morning. Right? That's helpful and it's useful, but we measure things that we believe are more significant than that. We try to measure things like people who are making a first-time decision to follow Jesus and be buried with him in baptism. But we measure things like people who may have come to church sporadically that are getting more connected. But we value things like people who's allowing God to transform the way they see the church, and they're beginning to serve in various ministries that we have, like getting connected to our foster care ministry called Embrace. We're getting connected to Family Promise, which is a ministry that helps serve families who are going through homelessness. Maybe Kids Hope and mentoring kids in local public schools. And maybe it's more specific on Sunday morning where you're serving with our audiovisual team or your greeting team or with those toddlers that I talked about last week. Right, serving in the church is another way for you to engage in the mission of God, and a healthy disciple does that. Right, we measure things like letting God transform our finances personally so that we become not people who give out of obligation, but people who recognize the generosity that's been given to us by God needs to be returned and invested in the kingdom. And so we support missionaries across the world, across the U.S., across Texas, and across the world, but because we believe the mission is that important. Right? We serve and give to the church because we believe the church is living out the mission of God. And we don't do this because the church wants our money. We do this because God is transforming our hearts. And that's what we're hoping for. And lastly, what we're trying to measure and look at, right, and by being healthy disciples, is people living out the mission of God in their lives. That means there are people in your communities that you are reaching out to and sharing the love of Christ and sharing the grace of Christ and sharing that God offers them something different than what they're currently experiencing through this world. And sharing in that mission is not something that is the responsibility of just the church, but it's the individual, the disciple. Right? The kids are talking about over there in kids' church today that God gave the mission to his disciples. Right? He said, you go and make disciples. He didn't say you collectively as the church will hire a pastor who will be solely responsible for the evangelism of the world. He says, you disciples, go. And so that's why. That's why is we believe that living out the Sermon on the Mount in our everyday life is the way we build healthy disciples, and healthy disciples build healthy churches, and healthy churches live out the mission of God to the world. And so that's why. What's the how? Well, that's the Sermon on the Mount. That's Matthew 5 through 7. And if you've never read through the Sermon on the Mount in its entirety before, I would love for you to take a moment after church today or sometime. It takes about 20, 25 minutes. Read through the whole thing. It kind of feels like a CrossFit workout on your soul a little bit. But either way, in the end, it's good for you, I promise. So what is the Sermon on the Mount? The Sermon on the Mount is Jesus' kind of teaching packaged up in a very structured, unique way. And it's formed by the number 3. Right? The number 3 shows up over and over and over in the Sermon on the Mount. And that helps us remember what's going on. It helps us stay focused on the sections that we're at, but it also connects things for us. We'll talk about that in a little bit. The first group of 3 that we find is we have an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. There's 3, right? I know, it's Christian college math. 3 is as high as we go. We're good. But either way, so we have introduction, body, conclusion, and then the body is actually broken up in 3 different sections also, right? The first section is about Jesus and the law. And he takes all these Old Testament rules, all these commandments like don't murder, and he's like, actually, like if that's the bar for following God, we probably need to reevaluate something, right? So maybe we don't get angry, right? Because anger is a way that our control takes over. And maybe don't take control of what God is in control of. So we have Jesus and the law, and there's 3 different there's 2 groups of 3 that are broken up into that section. There's 6. Then you move to the next part, and it's Jesus and the religious elite, right? He finds these people, these hypocrites is what he calls them. And they stand up and they give their money, right? Remember we joked about putting like the loud cha-ching sound in our offering basket so everyone can hear how heavy the coins you put in there. Doesn't really work with debit cards the same way. But the idea is if you're giving money, if you're fasting, if you're praying so that everyone looks around like, oh, look how spiritual Kyle is, that's all you're gonna get out of it. What Jesus says. If you're seeking the praise of other people by the way you live religiously, that's all you'll get. But if you're doing it with a heart that's turned towards God, you will be blessed. That's what the good life is. So with your finances, with your, fasting is a way that we recognize God's provision for our life. Right? When you pray, you don't just say, God, give me a new car. God, give me this. God, give me that. But you structure your prayer around the way Jesus prayed, a posture that says, bring your kingdom here now. And then we get to this last section, and we kind of grouped a couple of them together, and we're going to kind of work through them over the next kind of 3 weeks or 2 weeks. And this is Jesus and just social issues that you and I face every day. We talked about money, we talked about anxiety, and this week we talk about judgment. All right, being judgmental. So who is ready for I'm not going to, yeah. I know, it's one of those Sundays that I told Amy, I was like, hey, so she's like, what are you preaching on? I'm like, being judgmental. She's like, good luck to you, right? Awesome. But it's in the Sermon on the Mount, so we got to go through it. If we really thought about this, like if you look at statistics on people and their view of the church, this is one of the most significant things that people look at the church and say, those people, they're just too judgmental. And sometimes there are churches that they just wear it as a badge, right? I can think of one in Kansas somewhere that we don't need to talk about, but we have this idea that God is saying being judgmental is wrong. And then you have other people that are like, no, God actually wants us to judge people. Right? And then you have other people like, no, he just means condemn people. He doesn't mean judge people. And other people are like, no, it's not judge at all. You're not allowed to even talk to another person and tell them that there's anything going wrong. And so what is it? What is it? So before we jump into that, I want to tell you a story. It comes from Matthew 18:21 through 35. Now, at some point, you probably should go back and read this. I'm going to give you the shortened paraphrase version. But what happens is there's this king. Sorry, let me go back 1 second. This is a parable, right? This is not something that actually happened. This is a story that Jesus told that tells of a bigger meaning and a bigger purpose. So there's this king. And this king has a lot of subjects. And he has loaned out money to a lot of these subjects. And one day he decides, you know what? I'm going to call in all of these debts. And so this man comes before him and he says, the king says, you owe me some money. You owe me 10,000 talents. Now, a talent, let me make sure I get this right, because once again, math. One talent is worth 20 years' wages. He owes 10,000 talents. Yeah, that's a lot of money, right? That's an absurd amount. In fact, I would question the banking crisis situation with how much money this guy has loaned out to him at this moment. And so the king says, you owe me this money, I need it now. And the man begins to cry and weep, and he says, I can't pay this back. And the king says, fine, go sell everything you have, and then sell yourself and your whole family into slavery, and you can start working to pay us back for what's going on. The man's like, please don't do this. I can't live this way. Have mercy on me. And so what the king does is the king has mercy, and he forgives him his debts. That's a huge forgiveness, right? That's student loan plus forgiveness right there. And so what happens is this man's excited, and he goes home and he's probably tells his wife, hey, our debts have been forgiven. And she's like, good, we got to get things together. We got to work on a budget. We got to start getting things back to normal, right? And he goes, okay, first thing I'm going to do is I've got this guy working for me, and he owes me a little bit of money. In fact, he owes me, about 100 days' wages. And he goes and he grabs him and he chokes him and he says, you owe me all this money and you're going to go to jail until you can pay back every last penny. And he throws him in jail. Well, it gets back to the king. The king says, excuse me, I just forgave 10,000 times 20 and you won't forgive 100 days? You see, this story, Jesus is telling us, is really focused on the idea of forgiveness. But in all reality, it's the human condition that he's talking about. You see, Jesus recognizes that we as human beings have a tendency to receive grace and mercy, but to only offer judgment and condemnation. It's easy for us, and we're thankful when we receive mercy, but it's so easy also for us to return that mercy and grace with judgment, with condemnation. And so before we jump into all the things that Jesus may not be saying in this section, let's go ahead and read it, and let's connect it to what we've been reading, and we'll talk about that. So if you would, turn to Matthew chapter 7. I know, we're 4 months in. We finally made it to the third chapter of the Sermon on the Mount. This one will go quicker, I promise. So Matthew 7, verses 1 through 6, it says this, that judge not that you be not judged. For with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged, and with the measure you use it, it will be measured to you. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye when there's a log in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Do not give to dogs what is holy, and do not throw your pearls before pigs, lest they trample them underfoot and turn to attack you. This is a good section, and I'm sure at some point in your life, a well-meaning Christian quoted this to you. Also, maybe in your life, a not-so-well-meaning Christian quoted this to you. Also in your life, maybe a well-meaning non-Christian quoted this to you, and maybe also a not-so-well-meaning non-Christian quoted this to you, because judgment is uncomfortable, right? If someone has judged you before, you feel how uncomfortable that is. And so we make these little changes. We're like, no, Jesus didn't really mean judge. He really meant just condemn. Or he didn't say don't judge. He says don't judge wrongly, right? Don't assume, because we know what happens there, right? Or maybe he doesn't mean that at all. Maybe he's saying don't even discern other people. Like don't even tell other people that they're going down a road that's leading them to destruction and death. Like just hands off. I don't think Jesus really means either one of those. I don't think Jesus really is on either extreme of this. And the reason is because this is following on the heels of what we've already read in this section. Right? We talk about this. Context is important. Right? Context is important. And the two things we have before this in this section are do not be anxious. And the one before that is don't lay up treasures in heaven. Now, let me ask you this. Are you purposefully anxious? Most of the time, no, right? No one's like, you know what? I feel like being anxious today. Let me be anxious, right? No one's like, you know what? I really want to lay up treasures on earth today. Right? These are responses. These are things that we have by simply living as Christians in our world. And so what if judgment is the same thing? What if judgment is often our first inclination when someone is around us? But what if it's the thing that starts happening inside of us that God's saying, don't let it? So instead of Jesus saying, don't purposely going around judge people, he's saying your first inkling is to judge. Maybe instead you should try something else. See, this word judge in Greek here, which is what the New Testament was written in, this word judge can mean a multiple of things. It can mean like the legal pronouncement of a judge and jury, right? So think about like gavel, right? Like gavel thing, I object, you can't handle the truth. That whole situation is like legal judgment. You get that? All right, the second thing could be, is like an ethical opposing stance, right? So you believe you're right, they believe you're wrong, okay? So you're judging their wrongness and they're judging your wrongness, right? Like I am a judge of the fights that some of my kids go through when one of them is like hitting the other one and the other one is unleashing mental torment on the other one, right? That happens. And so we have to judge which one is right, and usually they're both wrong and they're both in trouble, right? You see, that's the second part is like ethical. And the third one can actually just mean condemnation, saying your sin is so bad God won't save you. I can't find a place in the Bible where God tells us we're supposed to pronounce condemnation on anyone. You see, because that's the work of God. And the whole point of not being a creator is to be a creation, and creation doesn't get to pronounce condemnation on people. Like this one is very simple, right? Like I hate it when people ask me this question. They're like, can you be a Christian and a fill in the blank? I don't know. I'm not God. I don't get to decide who goes to heaven and who doesn't. I know that I have sin in my life, and I'm hoping that maybe if I believe in Jesus and do what he tells me to do, that I have the assurance that God's going to save me, but I don't get to decide if God's going to save someone else. I can follow the words of God. I can help point you to what God called us to be his disciples, but I don't get to decide whether you're saved or not. I don't know your heart. I don't know your life. I don't know any of that. Neither do you. And so when you make statements like you can't be a Christian and a fill in the blank, you are stepping into a place where God never designed you to be. That's a dangerous place to be. There's this New Testament theologian named Tom Wright. He says, he doesn't mean that we shouldn't have high standards of behavior for ourselves and our world, but that temptation to look down on each other for moral failures is itself a temptation to play God. Anybody want to play God? How's that work out for you? See, we don't judge. We don't take the place of God. We don't look down on people because of their sin, because we live by grace. And in the same way, grace was given to this man who had a huge debt. His return on his servant should have been grace as well. So judgment on others, God is going to show judgment upon you. That's what it says there. Do you want to be tested and judged the same way you're judging other people? No, thank you. I want to live by grace. And maybe you follow this example, right? So Jesus says this kind of a ridiculous thought, right? So he says, it's kind of like if you're trying to help get the speck out of your brother's eye, but you have a log in your own. I don't know if you have a mental picture of that. You should try to make one right now. I thought about like putting an AI one up there because it'd be weird. But the mental picture behind that is silly, right? You guys ever play Operation, right? That game when you're little, right? You ever played Operation, right? Imagine if you were doing that blindfolded or with a log in your eye. Right? It doesn't work, right? It doesn't work. And so he says, you got to get the log out of your own eye before you can go and you can get the speck out of the other person's eye. And I know what you're thinking. Kyle, I don't have a log, I have a speck. Have you not been reading the Sermon on the Mount? Like, have you not been going through this? Like, I feel like the more I read this, the more aware of the sin that I have in my life and the need for grace that is there. And so when I look at other people, all I think is, man, I wish they believed and accepted and understood the grace that's been afforded to me. Not, I bet I can help them get the speck out of that eye. You see, Jesus isn't calling us to go around doing surgery on people. He's calling us to help them experience the grace and mercy that's been given to us. And judgment doesn't lead us there. Romans 2:1, Paul says this, therefore you have no excuse, O man, every one of you who judges, for in passing judgment on another, you condemn yourself, because you, the judge, practice the very same things. Jesus has a moment where a woman who's caught in adultery is about to be killed by the religious leaders. He stands there and he says, you who has not sinned, cast the first stone. He says, you know what? Sin is sin. And if you're going to be a person who calls out sin in other people, then I'm going to be the one who calls out sin in you. So what do? They drop their rocks and they walk away. There's another story, example like this in the Bible, comes from David. You guys remember David and Goliath, right? The slingshot hero, that whole thing. So David was the second king in the line of Israel, and God was preparing Israel to become this world superpower. And so David wins some battles, he becomes king, he starts developing the city of Jerusalem, and things are looking really good. For the first time in human history, Israel is a world superpower. So David says, you know what? It's time for a break. I'm going to take a couple months off while they're out at war. I'm going to just relax back here in the capital. What happens? Well, he has an affair. He conceives a child. He tries to cover it up. He kills her husband and then takes her as his wife. Things aren't good, but he gets away with it. No one really knows what happens. You know, he looks like a great king who finds this woman in mourning and he helps her. Instead of being a widow, she's now in the king's house, and this child will be raised in the palace, and things are going to be good, but God doesn't see it that way. So God sends the prophet Nathan, and he tells him this story. There's this man who has a huge amount of sheep. Like, he's rich, he has tons of sheep. There's this other man who's poor, and he has one, and he loves this sheep so much, right? In fact, he lets the sheep eat out of his, off of his table. Like, some of you have, dogs that, imagine your dog sits at the chair with you and eats off the table. I'm sure some of you cat owners do weird stuff like that too. I'm going to talk about that. But he loved this sheep. It slept in the bed with him. It was like his thing. And one day, this rich man had someone come visit him. And so the rich man went and looked at his sheep and was like, I don't really feel like killing one of my sheep. So he goes and he takes this sheep from the poor man and he kills it. David gets angry. That's terrible. He needs something coming to him, right? That man must die. And Nathan responds, you are that man. You see, when we judge others, we're going to be called to the judgment that we have. See, God had given David so much. David squandered it. And not only that, he began to continue to judge other people on behalf of it. You haven't dealt with the sin in your own life by believing and accepting and understanding the grace afforded to you, you will continue to live in the judgment of other people. It's just the way it goes. It goes that way. And if you choose to live by grace, if you're done by grace, right, and you live by grace, then you're going to offer grace to other people. Notice, he says to help get the speck out of your brother's eye. He doesn't just end it there and say, don't even pay attention to it. He says, help get the log out of your own eye, right? And just as a reminder, you have no ability to do that by yourself. You need the grace of Jesus to help remove that from you, to recognize your sin, to believe that you are a sinner in need of a Savior, to confess, repent, and accept the work that Jesus did on the cross so that you can see clearly again. And then your calling is not to remove sin from other people's lives. Your calling is to point them to the one who can. Point them to Jesus, who is readily willing to give them forgiveness and grace and mercy. Jesus tells us to deal with others' sin, but from a posture of love and not judgment. See, we keep going back to this verse over and over and over again because Jesus sums up all of the rules that God has given to all of humanity in these two things: love God and love others. And when you're judging others, you're not loving them. And when you're not loving others, probably not loving God either. So what if judgment was less about you trying to tell someone how wrong they are and more about you pointing someone to who Jesus is? Which gets us to this last very confusing part. All right, I'm going to read it again just so we know how confusing it is. It says, do not give dogs what is holy, and do not throw your pearls before pigs lest they trample them underfoot and turn to attack you. I was having a conversation with someone this week and said, what do you think about this? And they're like, honestly, I usually just skip over it because it doesn't make sense. Right? That's fair. It's kind of confusing. But as I studied this and I looked over kind of Christian history over time, I realized there's really three stances that kind of come into play here. First of all, it's the idea that if people are going to reject the message you give to them, don't waste your time with them. Right? So people who you know are probably going to reject the message that you're going to share with them. Maybe it's the gospel. Maybe it's about how good God has been to you. If they're going to reject you, don't worry about giving it to them. Just move on to somewhere else. Don't give to them what is holy. I can't see Jesus living that way, right? In fact, Jesus would not have shown up on the earth if this is how Jesus lived. This doesn't match up with the consistency of how Jesus lived. And so the second way I began to study, I'm like, maybe it's this one. The second one was this. In the Bible sometimes, the Jewish people used a derogatory term as a dog to refer to non-Jewish people. And so what Jesus is actually saying there is wait until a certain time to begin sharing the message with the Gentiles. Which again, doesn't match up with the consistency of what Jesus was doing on earth. In fact, often Jesus spoke and had disciples who were Gentiles. And Jesus said, I did not come just for the Jew, but also for the Gentile. It doesn't match up either. So there's a third option. And I hope this is going to make sense. But before we jump into the answer to that question of what it is, I'm going to tell a story. When I was in college, I worked part-time as a youth minister in the evenings. And so I waited tables to make money because part-time youth ministry in Missouri was not very lucrative. And so I waited tables in the afternoon from 11 to 4. And every couple weeks, this guy would come in. And when he would come in to eat, all the waiters would scatter. No one wanted to wait on him. And I was like, it's kind of weird. This single guy by himself, it's going to be an easy table, make a couple bucks, no big deal, move on. So one day, he sat in my section. And so I started talking with him, and I struck up a conversation, and I realized that he was a pastor in a local town nearby. And he would come into town to kind of get supplies every couple of weeks, go to the library at the college that I went to and do some study and stuff like that. And then he'd head back to his town. And we talked for a while. I told him about how I was going to become a minister, how I did youth ministry on the side. Grandpa was a pastor. You know, we had a great conversation about ministry and stuff like that. And at the end of the thing, he paid for his meal with a card and then left. So I was like, this is weird. Why does no one want to wait on him? So I show up to the table, and sitting on the table, there's a $100 bill. I was like, what? So I reach down and grab it, and I open it up, and it's not a $100 bill. It's a gospel tract. You guys know what those are? It's those things that look like a $100 bill, and then you open it up, and it's like, you're a sinner, and you need Jesus. And now I immediately knew why no one wanted to wait on him. There was no tip. The tip was, maybe you can have salvation. I don't know if that's the way God intended for us to share the good news of the gospel with people. I don't know what this man's intention was. I don't want to judge him based off of it. Maybe he thought this was a way that he could share the message. But all I know is all the other waiters in that Red Hot and Blue that I worked at, that restaurant, they didn't want to do anything. They didn't want to be near this man. And so I decided from then on, every time that guy came in, I was going to wait on him. And every time he put down a $100 bill, gospel tract for me, knowing I was a pastor or going to be a pastor, knowing that I had faith and believed in Jesus in the first place. See, that moment, I recognized every other person in that restaurant thought this man is judgmental, and he's manipulative, and he doesn't care anything about me. And I decided I'm going to love my coworkers by not letting them be exposed to that person. You know, sometimes what people need is not judgment. What they need is love. They need someone to listen to them and see them and hear them. You know what a dog doesn't need? A dog doesn't need incense from an altar. It doesn't need food that's been blessed by God. Dog needs dog food. A pig doesn't need pearls. They are worthless to a pig. Don't give people what they don't need by judging them. Give them what they need, and that is the love of Jesus. When you try to correct someone's behavior from a distance, it's called judgment. But when you do it from proximity, from relationship, from closeness, that's called discipleship. And that's the point of the Sermon on the Mount. That we don't just tell people you're wrong in your sin, but we say, let me point you to someone who can help you. Let me show you what the good life is. Disciples are called to walk through life with others, to love them, to help them, to point them to God, to show them that there is someone who loves them so deeply that no matter what sin they may find themselves in, there is a God willing to forgive them. A God willing to not just judge them from a distance, but to come close in the person of Jesus and offer salvation. It is easy and it is natural to look across any aisle you may exist in, whether it's the political aisle, where it's the generational aisle, whether it's any other aisle, and point your finger at people and say, I'm glad I'm not like them. It's easy to do that. It's harder to step into a relationship with someone who you may not agree with, who you may not understand, who you may not have everything in line with, and try to love them the way Jesus loves them. But that's what the Sermon on the Mount calls us to do. If we are going to be a church that engages of the mission of God to the world, then we have to be disciples who are loving people rather than judging them. Would you pray with me? Dear God, we recognize it is often our first thought to judge. But so often it takes time, it takes effort, it takes energy to love people well. And God, I pray that we would be a church not marked by judgment, but marked by mercy. That when people come into our church and come in contact with us in the world, they don't see judgment, but they see grace. They see Jesus willing to step out of heaven, to come to earth, to die the death that we deserve so that we can spend eternal life with you. God, I pray that you would identify areas of judgment in our lives and remove them in the way that only you can, with an understanding of the significance of the good news of Jesus. God, I pray that we would be people who speak loudly about the mercy and the grace of Jesus, and that we would walk through sin, we would walk through morality by loving people well. We just pray these things in the name of Jesus.